Clearly, all of these companies have been interested in licensing sports rights for live games. I think at this point, the way the market is shifting, I see Amazon as really the only one that's really, really serious about live games, and all of the others have essentially pivoted to ancillary content.
Hey gang, it's Wednesday, July 7th. Paul and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, the eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm still me, and today I'm joined by our principal analyst who covers everything TV and video, is Paul Verna.
Great to be here.
Hello, sir. Pleasure to have you. Today's fact: IKEA product names follow a pattern. Why do all of IKEA's products have names and not numbers? Well, IKEA's founder Ingvar Kamprad, who struggled with dyslexia, had trouble remembering the order of numbers in item codes that are typically used for products. Thus, he devised a system where himself and others could easily identify various models of things. So beds, IKEA beds, are named after places in Norway. Sofas are named after towns in Sweden. Kitchen tables are places of interest in Finland. Chairs are given male first names, and so on. Clever.
All due respect to IKEA's founder and his disability, but I would still probably be able to remember a string of 13 numerical digits than any of the IKEA product names.
Yeah, it's still, if you're not a Scandinavian
Yes.
Nordic person, it's just still tough, Ingvar. Okay? But yeah, kind of genius. The largest IKEA store is in Stockholm and at nearly 600,000 square feet. That's about 10 American football fields.
Wow.
Large is the biggest IKEA store in the world, or 1,000 times the size of a typical New York studio or one-bedroom apartment.
I have a lot of trouble finding the exits in any IKEA, so I can only imagine that biggest one. I'd probably have to spend 3 or 4 days there, overnights, eating.
Sleeping arrangements are comfortable.
Yeah.
They've
I'm
got
glad
food.
they have the
Why
beds
do we
right
leave?
there.
Why has no one attempted to live inside an IKEA like Tom Hanks in Terminal?
Exactly.
I'm definitely going to try that now.
I love the lingonberry pancakes, though, so I'd definitely be having those for breakfast every morning.
He's already got his menu set. Today's real topic: sports streaming. So, Paul, we're talking about sports streaming today. You just recently finished a report on that very subject. Lots of things happening in the world of sports. We're going to get to a lot of them. But let's start with the obvious first question. How many folks are watching sports on streaming platforms?
Well, lucky for you, Marcus, I counted them this morning. It took me a while and I was a little late to the podcast, but 57 million, 57.5. I know we're not supposed to use decimals, but that is the exact number that I counted just a little while ago. So
we're not supposed to use decimals, and you've literally just used a decimal.
I did. I went rogue. So yeah, digital live sports viewers in the US.
No one pays attention to the rules. 57 million, yes.
Yeah, and that number is going to go up quite a bit to over 90 million by 2025. So, we're going to see in those 4 years, we're going to see growth of over 30 million people watching digital live sports.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, digital live sports, that 58 million would basically be about 17% of the population. But as you point out, by 2025, that's 17% growing to 26% of the population. It's interesting to see as well, Paul, that US live sports viewers, not the digital people, but US live sports viewers, that number is also going up.
It is?
I say going up. It's creeping up by, it's basically growing in lockstep with population growth.
Yeah. So it's not real growth. It's really more just keeping up. But we're looking at about 156 million this year, and that's going to go up to 162 million. So yeah, growth of about 6 million people over 4 years, which is very little. And really what this means is that all of the growth is coming on the digital side. And it also means that traditional TV sports viewing is declining. That's partly a fact of life with TV viewing in general. It's also a demographic shift where, as we see younger people, get into sports viewing, they're doing it much more on digital streaming platforms than on traditional TV.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a bit more about the digital side, but really quickly on the live sports viewers. So 47%, basically just under half of the American population watching live sports. That's in comparison to the 17% that I mentioned of the population, percent of the population who are watching live sports digitally. What's so surprising by that, Paul, is that you point out in your report the average daily time spent with traditional TV, the amount of time people spend watching TV among American adults, 3.5 hours in 2019. That's going to lose 40 minutes of time over the next 3 or 4 years. So by 2023, it's going to be 2 hours and 50 minutes. So people are watching less TV, but the number of people who are saying that they're sports viewers, that is remaining pretty resilient. We don't have sports time, how much time people spend watching sports, but you would imagine that that's pretty resilient because in February 2021, you point out Parks Associates, a research and consulting firm, you have some data from them which found 55% of US pay TV households said live sports was important to their decision to stick with their pay TV service.
Yeah, and I think the reason we're seeing that sports part of it kind of hold its own is that sports hasn't really changed dramatically. I mean, the game times are still game times and the number of games is still the same. And the urgency of watching them live still exists. Now, there is more, I would say, fragmented viewing of sports where people may not sit through an entire baseball game, but maybe, following parts of it, through fantasy leagues and whatnot. But for the most part, sports has not changed to the extent that other types of content like entertainment and news have.
Right.
So it's still kind of almost like a fixed property.
You're right that sports games, they haven't shortened in length, and so they're still the same amount of time that you would have to tune into, watch them if you were going to. However, anecdotally, I found myself, if I've taped a basketball game from the day before, when I do go to watch it, if it's not the Lakers, if it's someone I'm not terribly interested in, but I still would like to see some of the game, I'll skip to halftime and watch the second half. So I wonder if more people are going to start to do things like that when it comes to watching live events. Because, as you said, some people will just check the box scores, watch highlights, but I think there's that between watching the full game and highlights, which is through DVR, I can watch a portion of the game, the fourth quarter. Maybe I knew something happened big and that happened in the second quarter. Maybe I want to watch the entire second half. It's interesting to note, Paul, the people watching sports on skinny bundles, VMVPDs, multiple names. So yeah, VMVPDs, aka skinny bundles, aka KA live TV streaming services, whatever you want to call them. We're talking about YouTube TV, Hulu Plus, Live TV, Sling TV, Fubo TV. That penetration rate for people who are watching those, very low, surprisingly low.
Yeah, it's about 7% of population, and that's going to grow a little bit in the next 4 years, but not dramatically.
Why is that?
Well, primarily it's because those services have a relatively small footprint in the market at this point. I mean, they are growing, but they represent a relatively small part of overall pay TV. And I think what's also happened is that when those services came along 3 or 4 years ago, they offered a lot of value in the sense that they were priced at, levels that may not have been sustainable for the providers, but they were very attractive to consumers. It was seen as an alternative and a less costly one to the typical pay TV bundle, which is why we call them skinny bundles. At this point, things have basically normalized and the playing field has almost flattened where these services are not really less expensive. They can cost, almost as much as a traditional bundle, maybe a little bit less, but the differences are very small at this point. So really it's more about how people choose to get their TV signal, whether through cable, satellite, or these digital providers. So I think that has changed the equation a bit.
Yeah.
Sports are still very important to the VMVPD market in the sense that these providers, they all have sports content in one form or another. Some of them, like Fubo TV, market themselves as a sports, I think they call it sports first service.
Right.
So they were built as a sports service and then migrated to other forms of entertainment. But live sports being a key component.
Yeah. Talking about live sports being a key component, ESPN Plus, one such service. We expect ESPN Plus to nearly double their viewers over the next 4 years, approaching the 50 million mark, 50, by 2025. You know, Paul, in a report that in March, Disney's CEO Bob Chapek said, "We're steering as many rights as possible towards ESPN Plus. In fact, we won't contemplate rights deals going forward that don't envision ESPN Plus being a major player in the use of those rights." Your thoughts on this and how other TV companies are tackling this digital sports rights balance?
Well, I think the way they're doing it is similar to the way Disney is doing it. At this point, all of the major TV networks have streaming services and in some cases, very sports-centric ones. So what they're doing is when they sign new rights deals with leagues or with, other sports content owners, they do it in a way that gives the network a lot of flexibility to distribute that content across their properties, whether it's the traditional, flagship networks or the premium cable sports networks or the streaming ones. So in Disney's case, that would be ESPN Plus. NBCUniversal now has Peacock, which they have migrated a lot of their sports content to Peacock. In fact, they're basically sunsetting NBC Sports, which had been their premium cable, sports channel. So basically what the networks are doing is they're trying to retain as much flexibility in putting those games on their different distribution outlets. And a lot of times that happens on a case-by-case basis and very close to the air date. So it's not like they have a schedule 6 months or a year in advance. It says, oh, this one's going to be on Peacock, this one's going to be on NBC. They really just kind of make those decisions almost on the fly, depending on what they need at that time.
Let's talk about Peacock for a second, because the Tokyo Olympics, which Comcast has the rights to for supposed to be last year, which seems like will be going ahead this year. I'm wondering, what can this year's Tokyo Olympics do to boost Comcast's streaming platform Peacock, which launched last year with the hope of using the tentpole event of the Olympics to catapult its new service forward. What kind of an impact do you think the Olympics can have on Peacock this year?
Well, it's definitely a delayed effect because the launch of Peacock, as you noted, was orchestrated to coincide with the Olympics. Obviously, that didn't happen last year. I mean, Peacock did launch, but the Olympics didn't happen. So now we have a, lack of synchronization between those two events. But still, I think with a lot of the Olympic content being on Peacock, some of it potentially exclusive to Peacock, I think it is going to generate a lot of new activity on the service. So it's still going to benefit Peacock. And again, I think NBC has migrated a lot of content that originally was going to be on their premium cable tier towards Peacock. So I think they're basically channeling a lot of their own customers toward the digital side of their portfolio.
When you were talking about ESPN Plus, you mentioned companies signing new rights deals. And in April, the NFL signed the most valuable media deal for any US sports league in history, according to CNBC, inking new rights deals thought to be worth over $100 billion or $10 billion annually for all of its TV packages, with most extending their current NFL deals to 2033. Fox and CBS held on to their Sunday games. NBC kept Sunday Night Football, and ESPN will continue broadcasting Monday Night Football with a slight ABC change. Each of those networks will also be part of the Super Bowl rotation, starting with NBC next year. The only major change, Paul, to the new rights deal seemed to be Thursday Night Football. Fox and the NFL Network currently have it, but from 2023, Amazon Prime Video will get exclusive rights to those games after paying a reported $10 billion. We did talk about this when this news dropped, but I wanted to get your take on it specifically, especially considering you just finished the sports streaming report. Your thoughts on this deal with the NFL?
Yeah, well, first off, as you pointed out, a lot of these NFL deals were extended by the networks, which I think goes to show just how valuable this property is. The fact that networks are willing to invest tens of billions of dollars in these rights. So that's not going to change. But I think the Amazon part of it is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, because in contrast to the previous deals that Amazon had for Thursday Night Football starting in, I think, 2017, this one, which kicks in next year, will be exclusive. So that means that if you want to watch Thursday Night Football, Amazon is going to be the only place you can do it. Whereas before, these were simulcast deals. So yes, you can stream it on Amazon. Prior to that, you could stream it on Twitter, but it was also available on traditional TV networks. So that's a really interesting part of it. I think the other thing that I see in this Amazon deal is up until now, we've looked at digital providers, and they included Amazon and as well as social platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and also YouTube. All of those had been vying for sports rights. And at one time or another, they all had deals for live games with different leagues. Sometimes they weren't necessarily in the US, but clearly all of these companies have been interested in licensing sports rights for live games. I think at this point, the way the market is shifting, I see Amazon as really the only one that's really, really serious about live games. And all of the others have essentially pivoted to ancillary content, whether that's, like celebrity-driven sports shows or interviews or, commentary, highlights, etc., but not full streaming of live games.
Right, because you wrote about a few different tech companies in this report. So you're saying Amazon is the most interesting when it comes to how much noise they're making, or just their sports content strategy in general?
Yeah, I think Amazon has enormous spending power, and they see this as a way to boost the Prime membership ecosystem.
Yeah.
Whereas I think some of the other companies, they would have to monetize the content more directly through advertising, which, they can do, but it's also, these rights deals are very, very costly. So unless you're a network that's invested in this type of content, it's really hard to make a go of it if you're, say Twitter or even Facebook. So I think they've backtracked a little bit, and they still see a lot of value in attaching themselves to sports properties in one way or another. It just doesn't translate necessarily to full live game streams.
Right. This is just the NFL, lots of other sports out there, but this rights deal did lock in those contracts until 2033. If some of those other major networks lock in those contracts for a similar amount of time, does that just mean that the landscape stays the same for the next decades? Essentially, yes, although more and more of the networks, I think, are going to funnel more and more of this content to their streaming platforms. So I think we're still going to see a digital migration. And there's more of that built into this deal than normal, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But, nevertheless, you're still going to see the same network groups owning the rights. So that's not going to change. I think also one thing that will change is the experience of watching sports is going to evolve, where I think we're going to have more customization, more, different user interfaces, multiple screens, potentially access to fantasy content right in the stream. There are some restrictions around that in the laws that allow sports betting to be legal in various states. Some of them, prohibit networks from basically putting those two things together in a way that they would like to. So they still have to keep them somewhat separate, but there's still going to be a change in the experience. And I think we're already seeing it. Amazon has these overlays on the screen, and there are ways that you can customize your viewing experience to access deeper statistics than what might be available on the conventional broadcast, and, different camera angles and so forth. So I think we're going to see that. And that's not just going to happen on Amazon or other tech companies that carry sports. I think it's going to happen across the board.
Joe Flint of the Wall Street Journal recently reported that the NFL hired Goldman Sachs to explore potential partnerships for its media properties, things like the NFL Network, Red Zone pay TV channels, and NFL.com. Such potential deals could include selling stakes to strategic partners, a move aimed at expanding the reach of its TV networks and digital services, Mr. Flint writes. Paul, what's going on here? How significant is this?
I think what's going on is the NFL has these properties like NFL Network and Red Zone that they haven't gotten as much value out of as they think they can get by partnering with streaming services or potentially TV networks. So really, I think what's going on is they see the potential to monetize these properties through, partnership deals. And they think that companies, they haven't named specific companies yet because they haven't officially partnered with them, but you could certainly see the potential for a Facebook or an Amazon to take these things to the next level, or even potentially like an ESPN Plus. So any of the media or tech companies that have done really well in the direct-to-consumer economy and that are pushing the envelope in terms of the consumer experience of watching sports and distributing content across different territories, those are all things that the NFL is not in a particularly great position to do. So I think they see more potential in partnering with companies that are going to pay them money in exchange for, some control over the content. But ultimately, I think the NFL benefits in the same way that they've benefited from the traditional rights deals.
Got it. That's all we've got time for the first half. It's time now for the halftime report, where we summarize the key takeaways from the lead story in 30 seconds or less. Paul, your key takeaways from the first half are?
The biggest takeaway to me is the migration of sports viewing to digital. And I think that's going to have a big knock-on effect on the whole TV viewing market. And it's also going to enhance and change the viewing experience.
That's all we've got time for the lead story. Time now for In Other News. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtex.com/eMarketer to learn more. All right, folks, we are back today in other news. Highlights from the Upfronts, Univision launching a new Spanish language streaming service, and how to balance box office releases and streaming. Story 1, the Upfronts, where TV and video people sell their inventories to advertisers, wrapped up just last month. Sellers like NBCUniversal, Fox, and the CW network secured double-digit increases in ad rates, notes Insider Intelligence analyst Daniel Carnahan. Disney called it the strongest upfront in history, noting that 4 out of $10 that the company made were streaming and digital dollars. For buyers, one of the big wins was acquiring more flexible contracts, given such a tumultuous and unpredictable 2020. Paul, what stood out to you the most with regards to this year's upfronts, and why?
I would narrow it down to 3 things. One is that TV and connected TV inventory is extremely valuable. Another is that advertisers love a good deal. And the third one is that the glut of streaming services that have launched over the past 18 months or so have been predominantly subscription-based. So that's opened up opportunities on the advertising side. And I can expand a little bit on each one of those. So looking at TV and connected TV advertising, if we project out to 2025, we're expecting an increase of $14 billion in ad spending against TV content. Now, all of that growth is coming from the connected TV side, whereas traditional TV ad spending is going to stay flat during that time. So really what this means is that TV advertising is more valuable than ever, even if that spending is going toward digital platforms. The other thing I mentioned was that advertisers love a good deal. So, by committing money up front, they're getting better rates. So, if they wait to buy advertising closer to airtime, they're going to pay a premium of 40 to 50% in the scatter market over what they might pay in the upfronts. And then the other thing I mentioned about subscription services is that there have been so many that have launched, like, Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, and HBO Max, that have been subscription-based. And also during the same time, the pandemic has benefited services like Netflix, which are, of course, not advertising-based. So really what that's caused is essentially a saturation of subscription services, and it's left an opening for companies like, Viacom with Pluto TV or Fox with Tubi to come in
So we estimate that the total US upfront TV ad spending, including digital, will grow by nearly 8% in the 2021-2022 season. That's good enough to reach nearly $20 billion, surpassing pre-pandemic levels. Upfront digital video spending will grow over 40% to nearly $7 billion, two-thirds of that for CTVs. Story 2. Univision will launch a new Spanish language streaming service that will arrive next year. The new service will have a free tier and a paid one that will focus on originals. The company says they'll be taking the best bits from parts of its existing services, Prende TV, VIX, and Univision Now, with the service featuring over 40,000 hours of programming, 100 channels, news coverage, live sports, and originals. Prende TV is Univision's existing ad-supported streaming service for Spanish language content. VIX, another free ad-supported streaming platform for Spanish language programming, acquired back in February. And Univision Now is a paid subscription service for live and on-demand Univision and Unimas content that costs $11 a month, notes Katie Keck of The Verge. Launch date and price due this year. Paul, what do you make of this announcement?
Well, it reminds me a little bit of Disney and all of its various, digital and traditional channels, and the fact that it acquired Hulu, so it kind of expanded its empire. Univision is a giant in Hispanic media, and they recently acquired Televisa, Mexican network. So they have a huge stable of content to, sell. And really what they're trying to do is maximize all of the different ways that they can do it. So part of it is going to be this paid subscription service. They also have, an ad-supported digital media channel. The U.S. Hispanic population is now at about 60 million, and that's about 18% of the general population. Within 10 years, that's supposed to rise to about 28%. So from about 18 to about 28%, by far the biggest growth in any population segment in the U.S. So, and also Hispanics generally skew a little bit younger than the general population, and in the past have over-indexed on digital and social media. So all of that, I think, argues for a service that caters to this audience.
In the US, 42% of Hispanic adults said they watched Spanish and English language TV equally. Another 15% said they mostly or only watched Spanish TV, as according to a March 2020 survey by Ninth Wonder and Think Now. Story 3, the entertainment industry's next act will be balancing box office releases and streaming, writes Kelsey Sutton of Adweek. She notes that the new Fast and Furious film F9, unlike many other films released during the pandemic, won't be available to stream at home upon release, just hitting cinemas instead. As Miss Sutton notes, Disney and Viacom CBS are going through title by title and deciding where to put films on streaming platforms and or in movie theaters. Warner Media, on the other hand, opted to make their entire 2021 film slate available in theaters and on HBO Max simultaneously. The company will walk back that strategy next year. To illustrate the mixed landscape, Eric Schwartzel of the Wall Street Journal writes, quote, "Today, all of the studios are opting for a mix of release strategies. In a sign of how topsy-turvy the release schedule can look, Universal's next two releases, The Boss Baby, Family Business, and The Forever Purge, will both premiere on July 2nd. The Purge sequel will play only in theaters, while the Boss Baby sequel will play in theaters, but also stream on his in-house streaming service, Peacock." Close quote, if you understood any of that. Paul, what release a strategy do you expect to see most widely adopted, say, by the start of next year?
I think we're going to see a mix. I think it's going to be on a studio-by-studio and case-by-case basis. All of the major film studios are now affiliated with streaming services, so they have potentially more to gain by adding subscribers to those services than by getting people into theaters. That's not always the case. In some cases, with big summer blockbusters and franchise-type movies, the box office receipts could be really a significant portion of the overall revenue attached to, to that movie. But in many cases, simply getting more people to sign up for those streaming services will be a better business decision. And I really don't think we're going to see the scales tip in one direction or another. I think we're going to continue to see studios use different moves. The post-pandemic pent-up demand for in-theater viewing, I think, is going to affect certainly this year, potentially next year. But then at a certain point, that's going to taper off, and we're going to see studios, decide accordingly. the number of movies that are considered essential to the in-theater viewing experience has probably shrunk over the years. And studios at this point have less invested in boosting that part of the market. It used to be that there was a real symbiosis between the studios and the theater chains. Now it's really more that the studios have different agendas that have nothing to do with box office receipts, whereas the theaters are obviously entirely invested in that.
Yeah, you said a mix. I was hoping that wouldn't be your response, because I can just see a lot of audience confusion as to where to find movies.
Well, yeah, I think there is a lot of confusion, but I think there's going to continue to be. And, I wish I could take a hard stand and say, oh, it's going to go this way or that way. But I really think we're going to be having the same conversation, at least for the next few years. I mean, eventually, maybe it will settle into something more predictable.
That's all we've got time for this episode. Thank you, Paul, for hanging out.
Thanks, as always, for having me.
And thanks to everyone listening. Thank you to Victoria, who edits the show. We'll see you guys tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, the eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX.